Greetings, my name is Mbekezeli. On behalf of The Forge, which is a space for radical ideas from Pan-African, socialist, feminist, and other progressive perspectives, and also on behalf of The Commune, which is a Pan-African progressive bookshop, I greet and welcome you to this discussion, which is titled The State of the Judiciary in South Africa. Thank you all for joining us. Greetings to the facilitator of this discussion and to the panelists. This discussion will be facilitated by Kelly Kropman from Kropman Attorneys. Kelly works with non-profit organizations and private individuals who face issues such as eviction, domestic violence, labor matters, and many other rights-related issues. The panelists who will be introduced by Kelly are Nomzamo Zondo, Niren Tolsi, Mbekezeli Benjamin. Before I sit down, I just want to express our very sincere appreciation on behalf of The Forge to the facilitator and panelists for accepting our invitation and for agreeing to have this crucial discussion on the state of the judiciary in South Africa. Thank you.
Look at me. Good evening, my name is Kelly Kropman. I am going to be the facilitator for this panel this evening. We are talking about the state of the judiciary in South Africa at the end of 2021. The judiciary has had some ups and downs as of late, and the public perception has changed quite substantially from what it was, say, 10 years ago. Today, we're going to be we're going to be looking at the state of the judiciary from the lens of an analyst, a practitioner, and a journalist who will be able to give their unique perspectives on where we are, where we've come from, and where we're going to. Looking at the judiciary today, we are confronted with questions of leadership, we're confronted with questions of discipline, independence, politicization, and a strange concept or a strange catchphrase that has taken hold recently, which was constitutional dictatorship. We are looking at, and this comes from our former president, Jacob Zuma, who has used that term to describe his displeasure with the judiciary as of late. Are we in a constitutional crisis? Do the riots of this year suggest that? What would be a crisis? What would the solution to that crisis be? These are some of the ways, some of the themes that we'll be exploring tonight. I'd like tonight to be somewhat of an organic discussion coming from our three very different but very poignant perspectives. So to introduce the panel tonight, we've got Mbekezeli Benjamin of Judges Matter, who was previously a candidate attorney at SERI, and then a litigator at Equal Education Law Center, and has landed at Judges Matter as a researcher and analyst and public figure. And he was doing articles as a Bertha Fellow at the same time I was. We've got Nomzamo Zondo, who is the executive director of SERI, who is doing some unbelievable work, specifically on constitutional damages. You'll read about it soon. Nomzamo's been working at SERI for ever.
8 years.
8 years, and has seen some landmark cases go through those hallowed doors, and seen the changes in the constitutional court's leadership, and seen changes in judgments, some for the good, some for the and some for the absolutely brilliant. And from that perspective, we'll see what a practitioner feels about the state of the judiciary. Then we've got Niren Tolsi, who is a journalist who has spoken about socioeconomic rights, about leadership, about politics, about everything that's in the public interest that's really important for also forever. You are much older than you look. And you'll be able to speak to what journalism has to say about the state of the judiciary. If you could give us a little retrospective and where you think we've come from as a indicator of where we might be going to, that would be great. So I'd like to start with the point of view of the analyses of the state of the judiciary. We'll then move to practitioners and then journalism. So I'm giving it to you, Mr. Benjamin.
Thanks, Kelly. I think when we analyze the state of the judiciary, we need to look at it at different perspectives, I think. We need to look at first, what is the role of the judiciary? What do we see the job of the judiciary in South Africa in 2021 being, and take it from there. And where I start my thinking about the role of the judiciary is basically on the Constitution itself, right? The Constitution carves out the role of the judiciary to be the guarantor of rights, to be the enforcer and interpreter of the law, and to be a check and balance against the legislature and the executive. So holding everyone in line according to the Constitution. So when we look at those responsibilities, can we say in South Africa today the judiciary is fulfilling that role? I think we comfortably can. Although there are signs where I think the judiciary is struggling, and possibly if there was to be a judicial crisis, that's where the crisis would come from. And I'm talking about the bread and butter issues that affect people's everyday experience of the judiciary and access to justice. So, for example, our judiciary is not adequately resourced. There just isn't enough money that is being pumped into the judiciary in order to make sure that it performs the task that it does. The Office of the Chief Justice, which is the government department responsible for the judiciary, is the only government department that has, since inception, has budget cuts. So ever since it was started in 2014, its budget has been cut gradually. And this has a real life impact on people's experiences, because if there is less money flowing to the judiciary, that means judges have to do more with less, and that means it takes that much longer for you to be able to access the court and be able to get your case heard. We've heard stories of the judges not even having the tools of trade to do the job, so not having access to researchers, access to libraries or subscription to the law reports, even IT, which is a big thing now, especially in the pandemic. Judges simply don't have the laptops to enable them to perform these virtual hearings. And so that's something that we should be concerned about, and we should really be making a noise about. And then linked to that, obviously, is the very performance of the functions. We don't have enough judges to begin with. If, for example, a court like the Gauteng High Court could not recruit acting judges on a regular basis, that court would not be able to function. The same goes for the Labour Court, same goes for the Land Claims Court, which is staffed by purely acting judges. So you can imagine how much impact that has on access to land justice. So these are some of the things that, for me, when I look at them, I get concerned about, and these are bread and butter issues and people's access to justice. And of course, there's the bigger issues that we see often in the media about the state of the judiciary. The appointments of judges, that has been a contentious process. The discipline of judges, or the lack of discipline, I should rather say, that is also a concern, where issues of integrity within the judiciary are not being dealt with swiftly, if at all. And that is also a concern. And of course, the leadership vacuum now, where we're seeing that the Chief Justice has exited, and now there's an acting Chief Justice in place. So that's, for me, are just some of the snapshots of issues that I have my eye on.
Thank you. So we'll delve deeper into those issues, don't worry. Nomzamo, just to start you off, in terms of your experience as a practitioner on all levels of the judiciary, what do you see as concerning trends or exciting trends that have taken shape lately?
Thanks, Kelly. So the first thing is, I want to look at how the poor generally experience the judiciary. Anyone who's poor in this country will first experience the judiciary in the magistrate's court, or they'll experience them being dragged into the high court, either because of an eviction, and maybe they're going through a divorce, but they're there because they don't want to be there. Now, what does the magistrate court tell us? And I want to speak to the picture both in terms of civil practice and criminal practice. When we go to the criminal courts, people are being kept in pretrial detention for long periods. The magistracy is being led by the National Prosecuting Authority, and are not really considering the role that they play, as Mbex put it, as the guarantor of the Constitution. So when people come into the criminal courts, even as members of the public, they do not experience a living constitution. In fact, they kind of see pictures of the past, because they kind of immediately when a person is accused, it's sort of, if there's smoke, there must be fire. If you are before this court, it must mean that you're a criminal or a potential criminal. And that's the real lived experience of poor people when they're dealing with the courts. And that's what is overwhelming me, for anyone who has a direct experience, what they will see. If they'll come to the High Court, the experience is not much different. And in the 8 years that I've litigated for SERI, I've only had 2 instances where I've had a judge address my clients directly, see them. And as you said, I've run cases where people have gone hungry for months. Or I've brought cases into court where people are saying, we've been kicked out of our homes unlawfully and we're here. And it's only been in 2 instances in the High Court where judges have said, we see you, we know you are here under very precarious circumstances, and we want you to understand that we're here to guarantee your rights. That experience is not there. The one thing that I've seen that is encouraging is in the early years of my career, it was quite easy for judges to come and say, actually, we don't like this constitution. If we're applying it because you will appeal us. And now in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been an acceptance, right? And I think it might be because of the JSC process. They understand that JSC wants to see how they relate to constitutionalism, what their role has been in developing constitutionalism. And for me, that brings hope, but that's only in the High Court. Right now, as we speak, SERI is preparing a research report mapping out what's happening in evictions in the inner city of Joburg. One of those papers focuses on the Magistrates Court. And we've looked very few, like 47 evictions between 2013 and 2018. All of those evictions were granted without a court knowing who's being evicted and how the eviction will affect them. I think it's in the 47, only 3 where the court considered these special circumstances. This has always been the law since the PI Act was enacted in 1998. But you have a court in Johannesburg, the economic capital of this country, acting in that way.
There's not much to add because I've had this experience, and it's not Johannesburg, it's not Cape Town, it's everywhere. Where I've had, I was saying to Bex earlier, I've had a recent judgment where a judge in a different province completely has evicted somebody using the common law, saying that PI did not apply. And the Constitution did not apply because they didn't consider personal circumstances at all. So I think that there is definitely still an inconvenience factor when it comes to the Constitution and the way that judges interact. But in terms of, Niren, I'm turning to you now, in terms of how the public is perceiving it and how, without the sort of dense lawyer speak coming through, what the judiciary is saying to the public and what their conduct is imbuing in terms of public trust or a lack of confidence. How are you perceiving it? How are you perceiving the progression that we've gotten and the state that we're in today?
Okay, so I think there are 2 interesting points to unpick there. One, perhaps we can maybe get to, I suppose, more in the discussion, which is the role of social media and fake news and kind of like aggravating misconceptions and paranoias around the judiciary, especially around like kind of politicians using unsubstantiated attacks to against various members of the judiciary without proof, including politicians who sit on the Judicial Service Commission, which is obviously a big problem. And I think we should come to that at some point. But I think part of the problem, kind of like, well, part of the issue that we're dealing with now in 2021 is that the former Chief Justice Mogoeng had 10 years in the job. So what we have is a judiciary that in some way is made in his own image, including the Constitutional Court. After Kampepe and Jafta's left, he's had a hand in every appointment to the Constitutional Court, right? And we know from the the record of the April deliberations of the Judicial Service Commission that the Chief Justice seems to have a very that he seems to have a lot of authority when it comes to picking justices for the Constitutional Court. In April, he gave the JSC a list, and the JSC pretty much rubber stamped that list. From what I've heard from people who've sat on previous JSCs, this has been procedure for a few years at least. I'm not sure if it goes back to 2011, but certainly towards the mid 2010s. So you've got a judiciary and certainly a constitutional court that is made in his own image, and sometimes there is a sense that there is a paucity of intellectualism. There is this almost Arivista sensibility, intellectual Arivista sensibility that I certainly get. And I'll give you an example which I found quite staggering and worrying. It was 2019, April, and the JSC was interviewing for positions at the Constitutional Court. And Justice Kachalia was sitting in for President Maya of the Supreme Court of Appeal because I think there was a conflict of interest there. And he'd raised academic criticisms of some of the judgments coming out of the Constitutional Court and had asked candidates very specifically whether they'd read these criticisms, what they thought of them. I mean, and I'm presuming his thinking would be that, you know, as anybody applying for a position in the Constitutional Court, you want to be aware of the issues there. What ensued after the first candidate was asked that question was when the next candidate was asked the question, Chief Justice Mogoeng went on this kind of like this bewildering tangent where he essentially was very critical of both the academy and journalists for having favorites, progressive judges, people that they liked, et cetera, and he made a staggering admission. He said that he doesn't read academic papers when it comes to the judgments of the Constitutional Court, and he doesn't read media reports. So if you're not hooked into what the country is saying about your judgments, is that not a problem? And is that anti-intellectualism not something that is very worrying for the Constitutional Court and also for the High Court, especially if you then consider things like, well, you know, the way the JSC has kind of done interviews for a long time, especially under Mogoeng, it's been ill-tempered, spiteful. There's a Circus Maximus kind of theater to it, which has made a lot of people reticent to apply for jobs. And what you then get, and you'll see this especially in the last few years, is a lot of attorneys with failing attorney practices who are then becoming, essentially they're professional acting judges. And then they apply for permanent appointment. They get appointment on race and gender, and very, very much less often on their jurisprudence or their lawyering before. So again, it's kind of like you're ticking certain boxes, but then you're not kind of like really actually investigating the lawyering and the jurisprudence of the candidates, which I think is very important when you're looking at progressive approach to the law, but also the issue of transformation, because it's not just your melanin count. It's also about kind of like how you perceive the Constitution in relation to ordinary people. So that's why I kind of disagree with Nomzamo a little bit when she says the JSC is kind of, I don't think the JSC is as taken as it should be by the jurisprudence and the lawyering of people. I've got a lot more to say about, I don't know if you want to kind of cut me off right now.
I don't particularly want to cut you off, actually. I do think that the latest round of the Johannesburg vacancies in terms of the JSC, and I spoke about this a little bit earlier, where there are people, and this speaks to this point, there are people that are shortlisted on the basis that they've acted, who may not have the academic prowess that's necessary for a well-considered judge. And they're being shortlisted perhaps on quota systems when there is a great deal of jurisprudential excellence that's available. But perhaps what I want to point out is perhaps there's a lot of excellence that is, within our group of advocates that we've got in Gauteng, who are not necessarily applying to become judges. And is this perhaps becoming less of an attractive position for somebody as the pinnacle of their legal career, and the caliber of people that are applying is lower and lower? Is this something that we're leaning towards? I'm not saying it is. I'm positing for anyone to answer.
I think I'll grab that, take a first step. But there is definitely a sense that the people who are coming forward to be considered as judges, the quality is definitely concerning sometimes. like Niren said earlier, there are people who are permanent actings. So basically, they've given up their practices, either as advocates or as attorneys, and they've been acting for a long period of time. And by the time they come to the JSC, literally they have nothing going except for being acting judges. And so it's not necessarily that you are the best of the best at what you do, but it's simply because you are able to sit for very long. And actually, there is no requirement in terms of the law for you to have acted as a judge. And the second concerning thing about acting is that there's also no criteria for how you get on to be an acting judge. So you're basically at the mercy of the chief of the judge president or the head of that particular court, who then delivers this benevolence on you to act. And so that there's a lot of problems there. But beyond simply acting, when you get to the interview as well, what should happen is that the JSC should be interrogating you about your track record as a lawyer, looking at your judgments, the quality of work that you've produced, the cases you've been involved in, all of those aspects, and whether or not you understand the fundamental values in the Constitution and how they would apply in that particular context. So, for example, if you are going to be considered as a judge in Cape Town, you need to be asked about the nature of crime in Cape Town. You need to be asked about gangsterism and how it manifests itself. You need to understand poverty and the law and how those things interact. And so those kinds of issues never get asked, and if they do, they're asked in such a superficial way that doesn't really assess the quality of the candidate. But a problematic aspect is that certain candidates, the interview doesn't even touch on the relevant issues. It really touches on what may be considered irrelevant issues, and sometimes it gets to the point of harassment, which is what we saw in the April 2021 interviews, where literally Julius Malema was shouting at the candidates and saying, "You're nothing more than a political animal." And those kinds of things, people watch, and people are saying, look, I've been a lawyer for a long time. I have a bit of a track record. And do I really want to subject myself to this? Do I really want to subject myself to this kind of process that will not interrogate my track record as a lawyer or even as an activist? And there was actually a scandalous round of the JSC where not even the Pillay one, but Gcina Malindi, who was a political prisoner and anti-apartheid activist who had spent many years as an advocate at the Joburg Bar. He was a silk. He ticked every box you can conceive of, but he was not appointed. So when you compare yourself to, okay, I'm not the level of...
And he was reduced to tears by the JSC as well.
And he was reduced...
For political fanfare and political capital.
Right. And when you look at that and you look at Gcina Malindi, who has struggle credentials, if that was ever relevant, he's an exceptional lawyer. He's a silk at the Joburg Bar. He has acted as a judge. So he ticks all the boxes, but he is humiliated in that process. Why should I, a mere lawyer who doesn't even touch the level of Gcina Malindi, why would I subject myself to that? So that's one of the problems with the JSC and why people are reluctant to put themselves forward. And those who do put themselves forward, they are competing at a base level, right? And so that also does not give credit to them, because now you're going through this process where you're really competing against people who are not really the best of the best, and somehow you come up as being a judge. And that we sometimes don't interrogate the life after the JSC, how people have fared. And I've heard from certain judges president and said, I wish certain people were not appointed as judges because they simply cannot do the work. And now I'm stuck with them because you can't even remove them. Once someone is hired as a judge, we've never, in the history of South Africa, or in the democratic history of South Africa, we've never had someone removed as a judge. So it's not only a problem for the JSC or at the JSC level, but it becomes a recurring problem even when someone is permanently appointed. So it's a big issue.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, I mean, what's also there's a very warped sense of transformation of the judiciary that emerges as well. Because if you see, for example, in a lot of the Supreme Court of Appeal interviews, what happens is that you have race and gender being forefronted, right? And then you have white males who sometimes have applied as many as, or have interviewed as many as like 6 or 7 times, being not being nominated by the JSC, but then asked to act at the SCA for long stints to do the heavy lifting. And it's kind of like they're still there, they're still delivering judgments, they're white males, but they're just not appointed to the SCA. And that's just like, I mean, is that rational? I mean, it makes no sense.
Absolutely. Speaking of April, and with regards to the Kazakh review of April and the re-interviewing process and Judge Pillay not subjecting herself to that experience anymore, is it time that we as a country, or our legislature, re-looks at how the JSC is appointed, and perhaps that the political capital that's attributed to this body should be changed to have more judges, more academics, and make it less of a political story, because we have big personalities exerting their personality in this space, as opposed to figuring out whether or not a person would be a good judge.
Well, that assumes that the political capital only comes from the politicians, and which it doesn't. I'm sorry to say. It doesn't only come from the politicians. I think what needs to happen, yes, we do have, if you compare our judicial appointment body, the Judicial Service Commission, compared to other countries, we do have a lot more politicians than what is common, but I don't necessarily see that as a problem. Because politicians often, that I've seen, the good ones at least, on the JSC, they've picked at issues that concern ordinary South Africans, that might not really concern the lawyers, because lawyers have a way of thinking that sometimes has blind spots, and which people who are not trained in the law can identify those blind spots and tease them out of the candidates who want to be judges. I can think of Togo Diza, who often used to interrogate candidates on issues of gender and how their judgments impact on gender issues, and how it impacts the lived experiences of women who are the subject of the court cases and the judgments. So when politicians do that, I think that's brilliant.
When they do that.
When they do that, right? But I think the key problem in the Judicial Service Commission is we sitting here. I can't tell you what the Judicial Service Commission is looking for when they are interviewing someone. I can't tell you how one person was appointed over the other. What were the factors? And that goes to that the JSC lacks a set of criteria which will guide them, which will focus their questions, which will focus their deliberations, and which will make sure that at the end of this process, we can be satisfied that only the best people are appointed. So I think that's the fundamental failure of the JSC. And obviously, having a written set of criteria is only half the job, but it has to be enforced, has to be inculcated, and the JSC has really needs to get some sort of focus on the task at hand. What is their constitutional role? They're not sitting there for their own political capital, but they are there to serve an important constitutional function. So how do we get them to focus on that job? And I think one way is the criteria, but I think also they just need a dose of reality.
I mean, so for me, I struggle with judges because of where they are in life. They will always be middle class or upper middle class. And to even think of a conceptualization where they pick themselves would be a problem. I would agree with Mbex that actually we need more, either we keep what we have or we need more diversification, or we bring in more ordinary voices in order to ensure they are judged at a level that is, what does it mean to have you judging something that affects me? And I think Mbex is right to say the legislature at best must give them proper guidance on what we expect you to do. Because, as you say, we can pick at people that, look, you know, when this happened, like I think, remember I think Judge Maya intervened recently. And she intervened in a way that was like, no, this is not how we proceed. But we should not be having that. The JSC should be a place where people can, one, firstly say, these are my expertise, and this is what I can do for the country. This is how I can move the constitution forward. And we're not having that because also we're in the middle of a political crisis as a country. And we have to consider what that means within the judiciary. That's one thing. And then the other thing that's very difficult, I think, in relation to whether people choose to join the judiciary. If you're at the bar, at least in Johannesburg, you're making 10, maybe 50 times what you'd make as a judge. And that reality, people who are going to apply to leave the bar and come and work as judges full time are people probably who've decided that actually I want to make this contribution. I want to do this service for my country. And unfortunately, there are not so many of those people around.
If I can just maybe just add one thing, I was just thinking. I think I agree with Nomzamo, and certainly the politicians are supposed to represent the people's voices, right? The parliamentarians, and I think Mbeks stressed that quite adeptly, that people like Toko Didiza and Tani Modisa, etc., ask very trenchant questions about that are linked to the lived reality of South Africans. But you also have a lot of MPs now in the JSC asking very political questions about Zuma, essentially linked to former President Zuma, or about things that the EFF are pushing on a public platform, etc. But I just want to make the quick point is that I think the JSC takes its lead from the chairperson, and what you have is Mogoeng, who's been brittle, thin-skinned, ill-tempered for a very long time. And I remember in the mid 2010s sometime, Mogoeng was overseas on one of his several trips that he was on after the Nkandla judgment, and Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke was chairing the JSC. The second time he'd done so. The first time was obviously when he'd interviewed Mogoeng, and it was a very different kind of ambiance to the first interview. But the second one was elegant, it was intellectual, and even the JSC members who are quite hardcore, Ishmael Semenya, I see, Ngwako Ramatlodi, etc. I mean, they suddenly by osmosis, they're kind of asking these smart questions, and they're not ill-tempered, and they're kind of they're actually being relevant. And so it does come from the leadership of the JSC as well. I mean, if you're going to allow this stuff to happen, obviously people are going to, it becomes a feeding frenzy. And Mogoeng did that often from 2012 onwards.
Just
go on.
Again, on the difference that the chair makes. Recently, we saw Zondo being the chair of the JSC, and it was completely different from what we saw with Mogoeng. It was a lot more dignified. Mm-hmm. There was a lot more focus on the real issues, right, on asking the smart questions of the candidates, and less about the personalities. Yes, there was an element of that, but I think Zondo, to his credit, he had a firm grasp
gravitas,
and the gravitas, right, in that room, and yes, the chairperson does make a significant difference with that. And I think, again, linking to this criteria point is that if there was a written criteria of what the JSC is looking for, it would be so much easier for the chairperson to overrule certain questions, to say, absolutely, Commissioner, in this particular question, you're asking a question that is unrelated to this criteria that we're looking for. So can you rephrase the question or ask a different question or give up your opportunity? So those are the kinds of things that the chairperson of the JSC should be doing. And as Niren says, for a very long time, we haven't been seeing that.
No, I completely agree. I wanted to move away from the interviews for prospective judges and talk about the Judicial Services Commission's other role, which is oversight and discipline of judges. And we have seen some stark complaints about judges. There was this sort of unarguable lack of ethical merit in terms of Judge Mabel Jansen, as she was then, and her private conversations regarding certain races in South Africa, and that having a massive impact. For people that don't know, Mabel Jansen had a private Facebook conversation with a friend of hers, I have to assume, wherein she expressed her views on different races and their propensity for violence. In South Africa, as a sitting judge who made judgments in the criminal court, she had no ability to be impartial, and it was very clear from these conversations that she was a flaming racist. So the Judicial Service Commission launched an inquiry into that, and she resigned. But the Judicial Service Commission has never actually removed a judge would she have been removed had she stayed and fought these charges? What is the point of an oversight body if they don't perform that level of oversight? We've certainly had complaints about judges, either judges breaking the law in terms of drunk driving or physically attacking other judges in chambers. These are the natures of complaints that we've had. Do you think there would be more complaints if these complaints were taken anyway?
So that's an interesting question. Do you think there'll be more complaints? The answer is that we actually don't know how many complaints there are, because the JSC does not disclose that information. They don't tell us how many complaints have been filed against judges, how many complaints have been dealt with in terms of have they been dismissed, have they been upheld, how many complaints are still pending. All that crucial information that tells us whether the system to discipline judges is working or not is something that the JSC does not disclose. And by law, they are required to disclose it. They are required to report to Parliament on those issues, but they do not do that. And that's also a failure of Parliament to exercise its oversight responsibility over the JSC. But the other fundamental problem with the disciplinary system of the judiciary is that it's far too complicated, it's convoluted. You know, for a complaint to move from one stage to the other, it has to go to a judicial conduct committee. The committee has to refer it to an inquiry. The inquiry can refer it to a tribunal. The tribunal refers it to the commission. The commission refers to Parliament. So all these different steps, all of them, they can possibly be an appeal.
Somebody could have finished matric, from grade 1 to matric in this time.
Somebody could have started school and finished matric before a complaint has been dealt with. In fact, with the Judge Kloppe complaint, which has lasted all of 13 years, So yes, someone could have finished school while that complaint was going. So what we need is a streamlined process, right? Which still, I think the fundamental thing is, shouldn't be easy for a judge to be removed from office, because we can see how that can easily be abused. But we need a process that is swift, that is effective, that can be able to deal with complaints against judges swiftly while still protecting their right to procedural fairness. That's what we need, and that's what we don't have right now. And that is a huge reputational risk to the judiciary, because if we see a judge assaulting another judge in chambers and nothing is done with that complaint, it's stuck in the system somewhere, we have less confidence that judges actually are accountable. And which is something that politicians sometimes complain about, I think, but their complaints are a little bit less nuanced than that. They simply just say judges are accountable, they account to no one. But judges should be held accountable, but the accountability systems that currently exist are just not doing their job.
I mean, just to think in our own work, Mbex, impunity, lack of transparency breeds impunity. And the fact that the JSC is not disclosing who's being disciplined for what, it means that within the ranks of judges, no one feels they'll be held accountable because they've never seen it happen. And we might not be in a crisis now, but the question is, what would that mean in 10 years' time?
Absolutely. And again, linked to people's everyday experience of justice. You know, judges, in terms of the norms and standards, judges are supposed to deliver judgments within 3 months. And the 3 months has now been extended to 6 months, right? A judge has to deliver a judgment within 6 months of the hearing. And if a judge fails to do that, the norms and standards say that the judge, the head of the court, has to speak to the judge and make sure that the judgment is delivered. So if
Can I ask you a question on that?
I'm going to come to your question, but what should happen is that if, as a judge, you haven't delivered a judgment within a year, and when we're talking about judgments, we mean someone getting their job back if you're in the labor court. So that means you've gone a year without an income, right? And you are hungry and you need that judgment, and the judge is taking their sweet time. You are any kind of matter that you can imagine that affects people's reality. And the norms and standards say that a criminal trial has to be concluded within 9 months of the plea. Well, the plea has to be 3 months and trial 6 months, right? And that means you're languishing.
Getting really hot over here.
People are like you're languishing in prison, and the judge is taking their time to deliver that judgment. And what we've seen is to their credit again, the Office of the Chief Justice releases these statistics, the list of judges or judgments that have taken a year, 6 months or longer to be delivered. That list is growing day by day. The Judicial Service Commission is supposed to be hauling those judges to disciplinary hearings and saying, why are you not delivering a judgment? Why has it taken you a year to deliver a judgment? And they are not doing that job. So that means people's access to justice is actually affected by those kinds of things. So it's not just an abstract thing that we're trying to get judges behaving badly to, right? It's not really about that. It's people's lived reality and their experience of justice. So a failure by the JC to do its job also contributes to that kind of problem.
So my question for you two, what's the longest you've waited for a judgment? I'll give you mine, 3 years, Johannesburg Division.
I can't remember, but I can say today 11 months.
11 months, yeah.
And you?
For me, I think the longest was, well, I think Walu at Seri.
Yeah, it was 15 months.
It was 15 months.
Yeah, 15 months.
I'm glad I won. 3 years.
But again, you see, that's a problem that should never have arisen. It should never arise. We should be having judges who are sensitive to people's the time that it takes to deliver judgments, and to be quite fair on them. Judges work under very difficult conditions. I don't want us to take it for granted how difficult it works. What I said earlier about the resources for judges to do their job is it also contributes to the delays in judgments. If you think about the Gauteng High Court again, it has about 80 judges, and the researchers that are there for the judges they're less than 10, or if not less than 20, to serve 80 judges, and they deal with it's the busiest court in the country. They deal with some of the biggest commercial cases in the country. All the government-related cases go to the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria. And that means those judges are under severe pressure to deliver on the job. And perhaps that's why it takes 6 months or more for them to deliver judgments. But again, I'm not putting that up as an excuse, but we also need to understand that context. And there should be more resources given to them, but at the same time, they should hold up their end of the bargain and deliver judgments on time.
So the question is, do we need Ronald Lamola to do more?
Yes.
Is that where the buck stops?
That's partly where the buck stops. Again, the judiciary is in such a state, guys, because we spoke about the magistracy. Do you know that the magistracy is under a different government department from the higher court's judiciary? The higher court's judiciary is governed by the Office of the Chief Justice, which is a national government department. The magistracy falls under the Department of Justice. They are governed separately. They are budgeted separately. They have different resources allocated to them. We saw now that the Department of Justice had a ransomware attack where all their IT systems went down. That means that anything from email to the stenographers in court, in the magistrate's court, could not function. And again, it just speaks to the system of the judiciary not being streamlined, not being adequately resourced, and provided with the necessary tools for them to do their day-to-day job.
Thank you. I think what's very interesting on the magistracy is the complaints procedure within the magistracy is so very different from the Judicial Service Commission, but equally cloaked. So I've brought a complaint against a magistrate before. You complain to the chief magistrate of that court. They don't have to tell you the answer of the outcome or whether an investigation's taken place. So I say this magistrate has acted improperly because they took a bribe, for example. And I watched them take a bribe, for example. This didn't happen. And I write to the chief magistrate and I say, Chief Magistrate, I saw your magistrate take a bribe. And my case was severely prejudiced as a result. And the chief magistrate says, noted. So I think that there are serious questions about why a lower court and a higher court have two completely parallel and separate systems. Perhaps we need to be looking at streamlining that process too. I can't say I'm facilitating the conversation.
To their credit, the magistracy, which is something that I don't give them credit a lot for, but they have a system that is a little bit more responsive than the JSC. And Parliament has a way more oversight over the magistracy than it does for the higher court judiciary. And perhaps maybe that's a time that we have a single judiciary, right? Where these kinds of things are streamlined. But, you know, the Magistrates Court Act says that within 7 days of a magistrate being, a complaint being reported to the Magistrates Commission, it has to be reported to the minister. The minister has to inform Parliament, and then suspension has to initiate. And during that time, there's preliminary suspension, has to be reported to Parliament, and during that time, the investigation has to go ahead. There are strict timelines for the investigation to happen. There are strict timelines for the Magistrates Commission to report back to Parliament on the progress of the investigation. Parliament can decide that during that period of time when the magistrate is suspended, especially in cases where the magistrate, the accused magistrate is maybe obstructing the process, Parliament can decide to suspend their salary during that period of suspension. So it is far more responsive, it is far more robust than the higher court's judiciary. And those kinds of things should be lessons for the JSC, but of course, because these systems operate on completely different worlds, we see a completely different experience of the judiciary being held accountable.
I mean, that's very dark and very sad. In terms of what we should be looking at, what the public wants out of the judiciary, out of our Judicial Service Commission, what do you think we should be petitioning, we should be campaigning, there should be public advocacy for in terms of the changes? Now, you've already spoken to the need for some sort of matrix. This is the criteria that makes, of what we're looking for in our judiciary. What other features could we look at in terms of changing the way the Judicial Service Commission operates? How could we, what should we be advocating for? What are the changes that we'd like to see?
Sure. The thing is that I'm going to be so pedestrian. Like in the match court, can we have a court that runs from 9 to 4?
Or the High Court in the Northwest, for example.
Won't say anything about that. But just basically knowing, especially in the criminal courts, that every minute that the court is supposed to be operating, there is someone on duty. We know there's tea time, there's lunch time. But I promise you, if you go to any of the magistrates' court, it's actually an exception to have a court that runs for the full hours that the court is supposed to sit. So like, I just want, like, that's the first thing that Minister Lamola must be looking at. Second thing, I've been screaming to everyone about this because I don't get it, Kelly. Right now, because of COVID, all the magistrates' courts are alternating. What that means is that if you're an accused person who's supposed to make a first appearance, instead of having 4 courts that will deal with 80 accused people, you have 2 courts that will deal with 80 accused persons. Sorry for the English. And what that means is that, of course, these people are coming back into court. It actually means that COVID is being shared while we serve the one magistrate who has 2 to 3 meters between them and the public gallery, who has an office that's probably as big as the room that we're in. So there needs to be a mind shift within the Department of Justice and within even the JSC about why do we have a judiciary? They lack the service component And I think I feel it, especially when you're talking about criminal matters, because you have people in detention, most of the cases. And then even like now with the unrest, the point that I raised earlier about the NPA, the NPA issued a directive that says every person must be returned to detention for the first 7 days. And if we ask the NPA to release what happened, we'll find that at least in 80% of the cases, everybody was in detention for 7 days. It didn't matter that you had a 3-month-old baby at home who was breastfeeding. It didn't matter that you had a job that you could lose. It didn't even matter that you had been caught up while you were trying to cross the road to go somewhere else, because the magistrates are sleeping on the job. They are not exercising their judicial function, and they are definitely not guaranteeing the rights of accused people. And so for me, like, I'm just being very pedestrian. Okay, like that's the
I don't think
least
this
that
is
I
pedestrian. I think this is grassroots and vitally important.
Yeah, and some of these things, yeah, we haven't touched on COVID, right? And yeah, man, COVID, during the lockdown, there were no cases that were being dealt with. There were certain cases that were prioritized. Child maintenance cases, domestic violence cases, very few, like there were no evictions being done. So that kind of thing, there were first appearances and bail appearances that were done in some courts, and that kind of thing built up a huge backlog of cases. And again, the leadership qualities, that there should be a strategy right now, publicly available, where we see that the courts are trying to deal with these COVID backlogs. To the credit of a court like Johannesburg High Court, they were able to move quite swiftly to online. And they already were using an online system even pre-COVID called Case Lines. That Case Lines project was supposed to be rolled out nationally, at least since 2019. And we sit in 2021 and only Gauteng has that system.
I love case lines.
And they were able to navigate those kinds of issues. So, but still, even when they have the technology and the like, you speak to the magistrate in Velcom, and they're like, we couldn't move online. We have a intermittent access to electricity in the first place. We don't even have network. Like
leave interconnection out of it, just
electricity. I spoke to the magistrate in Lusikisiki in the Eastern Cape. They don't even have cell phone reception. And you're talking about internet and online platforms. And so we live in a country where there's two South Africas, or multiple South Africas if we actually drill down to the real issues. And so we sometimes divorce the judiciary from the rest of society, but the issues, the problems that are in the rest of society very much are in the judiciary. And I can't pinpoint a single thing that I would change, because there are just too many things. But I think leadership is something that we are sorely lacking, and I must give credit to certain judicial leaders within, like judges, presidents, chief magistrates, who've been responsive to the reality and working with the limited resources that they have. They've been trying to deliver justice as much as possible. So if, for example, a court has to close down for the whole day for decontamination, they will much rather insist that decontamination happens for half the day, so there's at least for the rest of the day they can still deliver access to justice. So that's a leadership question. It's not really about the resources and the like, but what you do with what you have. And we've seen a lot of that, but obviously it's still lacking in many crucial parts.
Yeah, I mean, one of the stories that I'm reminded of is during the first hard lockdown, Germiston had a decontamination issue. So the court happened outside that day. I mean, that's an issue of leadership, right? That's an example of leadership. Decontamination happened, court still needed to happen, and Germiston's a busy court. So it happened outside. Whereas you get other courts that decide, the master's office, which is another place that justice should be happening, just closes. The deeds office in Pretoria in the month of July had 5 working days.
Now, I was going to reinforce Mbex's comment about leadership and just building on what you were saying. I mean, why did the Constitutional Court not sit for so long? It doesn't call witnesses. It didn't move over to online hearings very easily. As the Gauteng division did. I mean, why is that? And it's interesting. I mean, I keep going back. Well, I'm starting to sound like a broken record now. But I'm reminded of the 2011 interview of the Chief Justice, where Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke kind of at some point asked the former Chief Justice, now Pastor Mogoeng, what attributes he had to qualify for Chief Justice. And he said one of the things he was very successful at was arranging this judicial conference. And under his breath, Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke said, well, I mean, arranging a conference and leading the judiciary are two very different things. And it does come back to leadership, and it does come back to the failings of a man who had pushed his candidacy forward as an administrator and has failed as an administrator. I mean, and you see that if you compare the Gauteng division of the High Court and what Dunstan Mlambo's done there, what he did at the Labour Appeal Court before that, and you compare what Mogoeng has done over his 10 years, again we have this reflection of a judiciary that is in the mold of our pastor now.
So on that, what I was reflecting on earlier today was the three Chief Justices prior all seem to have a very specific idea and vision for the judiciary, and especially for the Constitutional Court. Do you think that Mogoeng's vision was myopic, or do you think that his vision was very specific and that's what he got?
I can't speak to Pastor Mogoeng's vision, but what I'm always reminded of when I think of him and I think of the judiciary and where it is now, a decade later, is that he is a Zuma appointee, and former President Zuma had very specific intentions when he appoints people. He may, I mean, the Pastor Mogoeng may have in 2016 handed down the Nkandla judgment, which was an obvious one to hand down because counsel for the former president had conceded already, right? There's nothing groundbreaking or revolutionary or kind of like poetic or elegant about the judgment itself. In fact, it's quite like purple prose and like very biblical in some instances. Sorry, now I've just gone off on a tangent. I think what was I talking about? I forgot to say.
What was Mogoeng's vision?
Vision, yeah. Yeah. Look, I mean, yeah. So the point I was making is that he is a Zuma appointee, and unfailingly, former President Jacob Zuma has appointed people that he thinks either in some small way will look out for him, whether it's appointing retired Judge Ian Farlam to the Marikana Commission. I mean, purely on the basis that Farlam had found in a minority judgment for him at the SCA a few years earlier related to was it Thint or Tails? It was Thint, and Nicholson, because he was appointed to the Cricket Commission because he'd kind of like chucked out the corruption thing in the matter against him in the KZN High Court, etc. So even if there isn't an actual kind of like connection between him, he still thinks, I'd rather appoint a homeboy from KZN, I'd rather appoint somebody who has maybe at some point found or maybe intellectually kind of like not of the same stature of a lot of the people at the Constitutional Court. I mean, granted, a lot of the judges at the Constitutional Court at the time had turned down Zuma's approaches, right? From what I hear. And Mogoeng is the only one to break ranks. So I can't speak to Mogoeng's vision. All I can I'm reminded of what Jem Kutsia said when Salman Rushdie couldn't come to the Mail and Guardian book fair for like 2 decades ago because of the fatwa against him, and people in South Africa were kind of objecting. And Kutsia said, the problem with fundamentalists is that they only believe in one book, and it's not the Constitution. It's their Bible or the Quran, etc. So in Nkandla you can probably read Amos. In various other judgments you can read Paul, etc., rather than the Constitution, I think. So that's sorry.
So I'd like to add a different take on Mogoeng. We sitting here, we don't know why he was picked, and there are many theories that are circulating. And one of
Because he
them,
was the worst choice possible. He was the most junior judge there. That's why. That's what Zuma would do. He'd go for like the worst possible option. That's what he does. He erodes institutions.
yeah, and and look, one of the reasons is that he worked quite closely with then Chief Justice Ngobo in organizing this conference. And part of the conference was that it was supposed to be a move towards a single judiciary and building up the judiciary as an independent institution that is run by judges, that it has its own separate budget, it has its own separate administration, and so he had been intimately involved in that. And true to form, when he was appointed, he was very much in favor of those kinds of things. So the Office of the Chief Justice was established during his tenure. The norms and standards that I spoke about, which speaks about when judgments should be handed down and how many hours courts should sit, that is something that he wrote and published. The Code of Conduct for Judges, he also was responsible for that. The languages of the court, where it was English and Afrikaans, he moved it to English as a language of record. So those are some of the things that he was really passionate about and drove quite early on in his tenure. But in the middle, he seemed to lose focus. He seemed to be more concerned about his public profile, his international profile, such that he chaired the continental body that many different countries were part of, and he was president. He hosted a big conference around that. And as Niren reported, there was a period of time where he missed almost half of the hearings on the Constitutional Court because he was traveling. So
To Papua New Guinea, amongst places, to deliver lectures.
So that kind of thing makes his legacy a bit interesting to assess, because the previous Chief Justices had a different Chief Justice-ship, if you may call it that. Only he became Chief Justice when the Constitutional Court became the apex court, for example. And that meant that more cases came to the Constitutional Court and had to deal with a bigger workload. And right now, we can look back and see how that fared, which some say it's not really good if it takes 11 months for the Constitutional Court to deliver a judgment. But we need to also be aware that his reality was a different reality from the previous Chief Justices. And there were certain parts of it that I think were good. Having a written code of conduct was a good thing, I believe. But there were some things that were just not, he was just not there. He was elsewhere. And you can, and which is why he remains the only Chief Justice to have ever been found guilty of misconduct. Part of that is also his legacy.
Look, I think. Sorry, Nomzamo. Suddenly, I'm heated. I think Nkandla is instructive, right? Because usually for that kind of judgment, it would have been it would have been ascribed to the court. He put his name to that judgment. And it's interesting, I asked him at the JSC, I did an interview with him after the Concord handed down the judgment, why he'd done that. And he said he'd done it because he wanted to ensure that the court didn't attract kind of criticism. Now, the court has experienced like a lot of criticism before and after that. And I don't think he did it for that reason. I think he did it because he wanted that kind of profile, because he has longer term game and he needed to be affirmed. I mean, he's fragile, he's brittle, he's thin skinned, he needs affirmation. That's why Nkandla happened.
I don't know if I would go that far as to say that.
I want that moment though of Nkandla. We take it for.
And since Nkandla, he lost complete focus. He wasn't the same Chief Justice that he was before Nkandla.
But we take Nkandla for granted now in 2021. But in 2016,
it was revolutionary.
When that judgment,
Gauntlet had conceded.
No. It was revolutionary in its language, right? It was very, very strong. It used language that ordinary South Africans got riled up right? People got angry that the presidency was running roughshod over Parliament, and there was no accountability. So hearing the Chief Justice read that out loud on public television, that was a powerful moment. And we do need to give him credit for that.
I want to just say on that, he acted contrary to a lot of expectations by handing down that judgment. I think that was his seminal moment to assert independence of himself from the perspective of him being the Zuma appointee. I think that that was a very positive moment in our judiciary in terms of asserting judicial independence. And I don't necessarily agree that it went to his stratagem of affirmation ever onward. I think that if there was a stratagem where a court asserts their independence is never a bad one. Nomzamo does need to have an opportunity to speak now.
Just weigh in. I want to go back to something that and now I've even forgotten it. Niren, yes, this is all your fault. But basically, if we look at the Nkandla moment, all the discussions behind closed doors that we didn't hear, what was being said to him as an individual about the judiciary, about himself as a Chief Justice. And if you think about that moment and the fact that, as you said, he then lost focus, for me, I see it as a strategy that when you're in a position where internally you are very, very weak, you always look outwards for support. So it was important for him to elevate himself out of just being a Chief Justice here to being seen as as being seen as a jurist globally, because that would protect him and that would protect the South African judiciary. And I think we must not lose that. And that's why, yes, it's a complaint. You were absent, but at the same time for him, he was saying, I want to be visible so that people don't clamp down on what we are trying to build. And for me, for instance, Mbex, I remember being in Berlin, listening to what happens in every other country. How if there's a judgment, the president that just withdraws it with a notice, being like, dude, if Vodacom, don't worry, Vodacom, it's sorted. And the fact that we had Nkandla meant that in this country, the constitution means something. And that is Mogoeng's legacy. And the fact that he then put his head on the chopping block to say, go at me, don't go at my juniors.
I don't agree, but coming back to language and the call to arms, like for the nation, right? Glenister 1 and 2, is that not like more powerful, more profound than anything that you can find in Nkandla about like kind of like the soul of our nation?
Yeah, but it was broadcast on television. Other than people who've read it, nerds like me and you who've read the judgment, how many people know what Glenister meant? Or Glenister, that there's a Glenister 1 and 2. So I think we mustn't lose perspective of that moment that judgment represented, right? It's yes, I've heard admissions from academics who said, I can't teach Nkandla because there's very little law in it.
Exactly. Because it's all Amos.
Yeah, no, there isn't much law in it, but the significance of that judgment reverberated beyond just the law. And it meant a turning point in our political history, in our democratic history, and the institution of the Constitutional Court and the judiciary as a whole. So I think we can't give him credit for that. We absolutely cannot take that moment away from him, because that was a turning point in our history.
Before we Nomzamo.
Oh, okay. I was like, I can't wait. And Beck says this, but up until that point, for many ordinary South Africans, the judiciary was invisible. Right? And we can talk about, like, we want accountability. Up until that moment, for a majority of people who live in this country, they didn't see the judiciary. They were the invisible arm of government. And we could see them then, and that's why now what I talk about them being accountable. And that's why that moment is important.
I completely agree. I think the other thing that was extremely significant about that was a sort of new South African Magna Carta moment, because the judiciary put the head of state in his place and said, you did something wrong. and it was public, it was broadcast. And so that crystallizing moment, regardless of everything else that Mogoeng did, and I definitely have mixed feelings about Mogoeng. I think that moment had a lot of positivity for the state and for the public and for us as lawyers too. Yeah, like I said, my first opinion about Mogoeng came from that first letter. And it wasn't a good one. But that doesn't mean that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, in my opinion. I don't know if we want to go to some form of closing remarks about everybody's feelings from their specific hats that they're wearing tonight.
I have many feelings, and I think for me, looking forward and summing up some of the issues that we've raised in this conversation is that the judiciary is in a difficult point at this moment, where, like I mentioned, the issue of resources, issue of accountability, the appointment process, it needs a lot of work. And again, speaking about the role of the Chief Justice, and we've just now debated about what it means, we are right now in the process of a new Chief Justice coming in. The new Chief Justice inherits a judiciary, like I said, it's in a difficult point. And what we need right now is a little bit of someone who has a bit of the charisma that Mogoeng had in terms of speaking quite strongly about the independence of the judiciary and speaking for the judiciary. Because someone who will inspire judges to be, judges, magistrates, judicial officers, to take up their role quite seriously. We need someone who will repair some of the institutions within the judiciary. The JSC needs a leader, as we've mentioned. The judicial education is a hot mess right now, and we need someone who'll sort that out. We need someone who'll speak about the budget that is allocated to the judiciary. And so we need a leader in the next Chief Justice. And what I'm really worried about is that the Judicial Service Commission will screw this process up. But luckily, there are a lot of criticism that the president opened this up to a public process and is avoiding taking a decision. But I think it makes for a better decision, right? We will have a short list of at least 3 names. 3 of those names are experienced judicial officers. Any of them could be Chief Justice. And so what we need to look forward to is that, or what we expect from them is that they must take us as South Africans into their vision for the judiciary, what they will do for the judiciary, why they're qualified for the job, and they need to give us practical plans of how they'll execute that vision, and hopefully, and I'm sure that all of them have the best interests of the judiciary at heart. But that is a serious appointment, the new Chief Justice, and I wish that all South Africans will pay attention to that process.
Yeah. So, as a Christian myself, I'm more concerned about judges leaving constitutional values. And I understand that many of them had practiced before a time when the Constitution was relevant, had practiced an area of law where they didn't have to see the Constitution. And that's, for me, is a key concern. That moving at this point, where I imagine in 1994 or even 1993, it was important to have a judiciary that understands that, as Mbex put it, they're the guarantors of the Constitution. But now, when we're dealing with an executive and even a legislature that doesn't want to accept that, it's so much more important that the judiciary themselves uphold the Constitution, but then also, most importantly, from the events of July, make the country believe that the Constitution holds value and can do something for them. And the next Chief Justice will have that, that very, very difficult task. And I think if we're going to get anywhere, we need that to happen now. I think I'll leave it to Mbex and Niren to speak about everything else. But for me, that's what we need to get. Because for me, it's like, how do we get to the dream of 1994, the dreams we had in 1994? and out of the nightmare that we're living in now. And if, unfortunately, outside of the political mobilization and the political moment, the Constitution held that promise. And we need to see if the judiciary can actually usher in that promise.
Okay. Look, I mean, I kind of think things need a lot of work. And I'm just wondering whether, considering like the increased workload at the Constitutional Court, considering like, how much stuff that they have to think about allowing to be heard, not even kind of like, I mean, the workload is intense. If it may not be a time, maybe an opportune time to consider a constitutional amendment and consider new legislation to essentially kind of like divide up the job, because what one needs now, we need a jurisprudential kind of like leader to take the court and the judiciary as a whole forward in a way that is deeply profound and like linked to the everyday existence of like ordinary South Africans, who are unemployed, living below the poverty line, and like face authoritarian misrule every day at the hands of the state. There's that. And what you also need is an administrator who is going to be able to kind of like deal with like the shit show that's been left behind, right? So it feels like you need two people for that job. And I'm not sure whether that's going to be the Chief Justice and the Deputy Chief Justice, because as a Deputy Chief Justice, you're going to need somebody who is able to read emails and not like just be at the fax machine all day or have his clerks at the fax machine all day. It may be a time to be like really smart about like kind of like how we reconfigure the leadership in the judiciary to respond to this moment, which needs like strong jurisprudential leadership, but it also needs strong administrative leadership. And can one person do both jobs? That's, I think, is a very important question.
No, I agree. I think that this is a multifaceted job. It's a multifaceted issue. And I think that in summing up what everybody has to say, we kind of need our Herculean judge. If everybody goes back to Jurisprudence 101, we need our everyman judge that understands the plight of the poor, because South Africa is a poor country. We need somebody that understands the limitations that judges face and the magistrates face every day. That access to justice is kind of a lie right now. And it would be really nice that we didn't have 5 or 6 law clinics carrying the plight of the poor in South Africa, that resources to legal aid didn't really need to go 80% criminal, 20% civil, that maybe we just need to quadruple the size of legal aid. What I'm really saying from the Kelly perspective is that this is Ronald Lamola's problem and he needs to fix it. But that not everything that we perceive as the new Chief Justice's issue is necessarily the Chief Justice's issue. It becomes that person's issue because there are other compounding factors. But it is a pivotal moment in our judiciary, and I think that whoever has that next role is probably going to have a lot more advocacy to do than administration, because the problems are so much bigger than that of the Chief Justice's competencies. I'd like to thank everyone for being really kind of amazing and being frank and open about really touchy subjects, actually, and about a really touchy place that we work and the difficulties that we find on a daily basis. And we can empathize for judges, we can empathize for our clients, we can empathize for the public, and we can empathize for our Chief Justices. But this is all really complicated, and we're not going to solve it in the hour and a half that we've had today. But I hope that it's been valuable for the folks at home. And we thank everybody for watching.